Hello, hello, and welcome everybody to this week's low carb lesson. Today's topic is going to be what is insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. And today we're incredibly lucky to have Dr. Catherine Crofts here today to explain these terms and to explain why it's so important to understand what hyperinsulinemia is and insulin resistance to help us avoid future metabolic diseases. And I'm just going to read you her bio here so you can understand why I've invited her today, because she is the world expert on insulin. You want to know anything, you ask Catherine. So Catherine Crofts has been a pharmacist for over 20 years as a clinical pharmacist, hospital pharmacist, and now AUT, teaching undergraduate health science students while continuing her research on insulin and health. Excuse me. Catherine worked with Prof Grant Schofield on her master's thesis, and a PhD followed, investigating the impact of high insulin levels on health and disease. During this process, she discovered the work of Dr. Joseph Kraft, which we'll hopefully hear about a little bit in the end, and its extensive data set on insulin response patterns, which again, hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit about. She now teaches at AUT, teaching undergraduate health students, and she has a passion for getting people off the pills. So welcome, Catherine, to Ditch the Carbs.
Thanks for having me.
Honestly, we've known each other for some time now. We seem to move in the same kind of low carb circles, and we both live locally, and we're both pharmacists, although I'm no longer practicing. So it's wonderful to have you here today to kind of pick your brains all about insulin resistance. Everyone here today, they'll have heard terms like insulin resistance and carb intolerance, hyperinsulinemia, and we'll dig in these one by one. But let's start off with, what is insulin resistance? What's that kind of the fundamental thing that we need to understand?
Okay, I'm just going to pull up a picture for you, because that really, picture worth 1,000 words. So, okay, so insulin resistance is it's a really nebulous topic. Nobody actually really defines really what it means. But what it means basically is our cells stop responding to insulin properly. And we end up needing more insulin to do the same amount of work. So if hopefully, I might even get a laser pointer coming up. Okay, you've got the laser pointer?
Yes, I have. That's pretty fancy.
Okay, so what happens is when you've got a normal cell like over here, this is the bloodstream, the blue circles are glucose and the blue hexagons are insulin. Mm-hmm. When there is a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, like after a meal, we need to get the glucose out of the bloodstream quickly, because too much glucose in the bloodstream can be pretty damaging for the blood vessels. Mm-hmm. Causes inflammation, increases the risk of atherosclerosis. So when there's a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, we need to move it out fast, and that's where the insulin comes in. The insulin binds to some of these receptors, these dark blue, funny Y-shaped things, and it allows the glucose to move into the cells. But there's only so much work these glucose transporters, these GLUT4 transporters can do before they need a rest. And when they have a rest, they literally get sucked into the cell. And hopefully at this time, though, they don't need to do any more work, because the cell's usually full of glucose, and hopefully all of the glucose is out of the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. But if there is still more glucose around, you've had a big piece of lemon meringue pie or something, you've got a lot more glucose to shift, the body releases more insulin into the bloodstream. And that insulin will do the job of getting these transporters back up to the surface of the cell, where it can start shifting more glucose. And if this only happens occasionally, that's not a major problem. It doesn't do the cell much good in the short term to be overfilled with glucose, and it might shorten the lifespan of that cell, but it's better that an individual cell is a little bit damaged than the blood vessel, and the blood vessel lining gets damaged. So sometimes the cell has to take one for the team, and it's the body releases more insulin to shift the glucose. But what happens now, insulin resistance, it's a little bit like having a radio on. If we were wanting to listen to music in the background now while we're talking, or somebody in one of our backgrounds wanted to listen to the radio while we were talking, they might not be able to hear it too well because we're talking. So they'll turn the radio up. Because they've turned the radio up, we're going to start talking louder. Because we're now talking a bit louder, they have to turn the radio up. Okay, so this is what we call a positive feedback cycle. And it's very much the same with our cells. Looking at the bottom cell, the transporters have gone offline because the cell is full. Okay, I know this picture doesn't show a full cell, but usually what happens is the cell is full of glucose.
Right.
And the transporters go offline. These are these grayed out ones. But there's so much glucose still sitting in our bloodstream, so the body produces a lot more insulin to get the transporters back online and to shift out the glucose. But having a lot of insulin in the bloodstream causes more insulin resistance in the cells. And the cells start becoming more insulin resistant, and the body starts producing a lot more insulin. So having high insulin increases the risk of insulin resistance. So insulin resistance at its most basic term is having cells that don't respond to the normal amounts of insulin. And you need a lot more insulin to get rid of the glucose.
Yeah, so you need a lot more to do the same effect.
A lot more to do the same effect, but what people don't often realize is that insulin does it. A lot of people seem to think, and this is a lot of medical professionals as well, that insulin's only job is to get glucose into cells. In fact, it's not. That's the big thing. You know, we only focus on this side of insulin, but insulin's biggest job actually is to stop the liver from making more glucose.
Right.
So we've got a couple of hormones within the body. There's about 5-7 hormones that will raise the body's glucose levels: glucagon, cortisol, adrenaline, but only one that will lower body's glucose levels, and that's insulin. So you think about prehistoric man, if they've got so many, or even 300 years ago man, or for the Pacific Islands 100 years ago man, it was normally more important for the body to make more glucose than it was to lower glucose levels. Right. So insulin's biggest job was actually to balance out glucagon. Glucose gone. Let's make more glucose or release more glucose from glycogen. Insulin's job was to counter that. So insulin, though, also stops your fat cells from burning fat. If your insulin levels are high, because you're insulin resistant, it's not just going to get glucose out of the bloodstream, it's actually going to stop you from burning fat. And people, when they keep saying, I want to lose some weight, all they actually mean is, I want to lose fat mass from my body. Nobody ever really wants to lose muscle mass or bone mass. They want to lose fat mass. But you can't burn fat if your insulin levels are high. And if you are insulin resistant, then your insulin levels are high.
Look, do you want to stop sharing that one there and we'll have a wee chat about that? Because I think that's a really valuable, what you've just sort of said there, that was going to be one of my next questions is, you know, what else does it, I guess the first thing is we now know what insulin resistance is, you know, and people realize that, you know, if you live on a chronic high carb diet, you're chronically high blood sugars, you have chronic high insulin levels that leads to insulin resistance and everything else. And then that now likely leads on to what is hyperinsulinemia, because that's exactly what insulin resistance has now triggered. And obviously, once you've got hyperinsulinemia, like you said, there are so many different systems within the body that is affected by insulin, isn't it? It's just this whole, and I mean, we could be here for hours, but basically.
Oh, I spent so many hours looking at this.
Exactly. But in a nutshell, so people can understand, you know, they've now got what insulin resistance is. Now,
right.
It's going
so when you are insulin resistant and you have a carb load that is higher than your tolerance levels, and everybody's got their own tolerance levels, and it's got a lot to, if you're insulin resistant, your carb tolerance levels are quite low.
Yep.
And if you have more carbohydrates higher than your tolerance, you end up with a lot of glucose in the bloodstream. And it doesn't matter whether you've had simple sugars or highly complex carbohydrates, it all ends up in the bloodstream as simple sugars.
Yep.
Right. The time it takes for it to get there might change, but it all ends up there as simple sugars. So you've now got more glucose in your bloodstream than desired, so the body responds by releasing more insulin than needed. So anybody who's insulin resistant, as soon as they have more carbs than they can tolerate, the body responds by becoming a super secretor of insulin, and you end up with a lot more insulin than somebody who's insulin sensitive. And that insulin, yes, it gets the glucose out of your bloodstream, but it interferes with protein synthesis, it interferes with hormone synthesis, it interferes with nerves communicating with each other. It encourages it's an anabolic hormone, encourages the growth of other cells, it stops you from burning fat. And there's a whole lot more things that we are really just discovering as to where it is involved with. And so when you've got too much insulin, it affects inflammation, and inflammation affects everything around the body. When you've got too much glucose in your bloodstream, it can increase the platelet stickability. So you end up forming micro blood clots in all of your blood vessels, which can help to damage your blood vessels. Now, the body responds to this. This is a normal thing to happen.
Right, yeah.
Forming all these micro blood clots. And the body responds to that with a process called fibrinolysis, the breaking down of the fibrin that causes these blood clots, and it clears out these micro blood clots. High insulin level interferes with that process.
Ah.
Right? And the inflammation that can happen when you've got high insulin levels can weaken blood vessels, the lining of the blood vessels, and things leak out that shouldn't leak out in places like the brain, unfortunately, but also with nerves. We know that insulin's involved with communications between nerves and intercellular signaling, and high insulin levels disrupts all of that. So when you've got high insulin, you've also got high glucose. And when you've got high glucose, the body tries to deal with that by stuffing it into cells that are already extremely full. Now, have you ever seen the videos of the Japanese men who are employed to stuff commuters onto trains?
Yes.
Right, so you've got a train that's full, lots of people on the platform, and these Japanese, it happens in Japan, which is why I'm talking about the Japanese men. I don't know if it still happens, but I've seen the videos.
Yeah, I think it still happens.
Are employed to literally force more people onto the trains. Can you imagine being on the train when that's happening? You're going to get damaged. So if you think about your cells in the same way, they're full of glucose. The cell doesn't want any more glucose in it. But the insulin comes along like the Japanese men says, sorry guys, you've got to take in more glucose. So the cell responds by shifting the glucose out as quickly as possible, which means that we end up with the production of oxidative species and glycated products. And that damages the DNA within the cells. It ages the cell prematurely. The cell dies prematurely, and the cell stops signaling prematurely. So whether high insulin directly causes a lot of cellular damage or is just indicative that cellular damage is happening, you're insulin resistant and you've got high insulin, your cells are going to get damaged way quicker than they should, which amongst other things leads to wrinkles because collagen and skin production is damaged.
So if anyone listens today, stop the sugar, you don't want the wrinkles.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a good reason for stopping sugar, it stops the wrinkles.
Yeah.
So you've got all of these processes happening, and you will age a lot faster than what you really want to do, both physically but systematically as well.
Yeah, because your wrinkles are only one sort of visual aspect or one visual way of telling your age. You can't see how you're aging inside.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And your nerves stop talking to each other properly, which is really important for brain health. And when you think about the micro damage that's happening in the capillaries, it all ends up to there's a really high risk of early dementia when your insulin's high.
And they're starting to call it type 3, aren't they?
They are,
actually?
because if you've got type 2 diabetes, your risk of developing any type of dementia goes up dramatically. A lot of it is vascular dementia where the blood vessels get damaged, but insulin seems to be involved with, as I said, cellular signaling, but also some of these beta amyloid proteins and nerve cell plasticity, and they don't understand why. The brain actually makes its own insulin. So the pancreas is not the only organ in the body that can make insulin, but insulin isn't actually needed in the brain to get glucose into the cells.
So where does it make it?
Well, it makes it in the brain, but insulin can also be transported across the blood-brain barrier. But that begs the question of what is the insulin doing in the brain if it's not needed to get glucose into cells? Because every cell within the body will take up glucose in a very passive format that doesn't need insulin. You do not need insulin to get glucose into cells. You need insulin for massive, rapid transport of glucose out of the bloodstream, but you don't need insulin to get glucose into the cells. So what the insulin's doing in the brain, we're still trying to figure that one out, but it seems to be involved with hormone production, satiety and appetite regulation within the hypothalamus. It seems to have something to do with the sense of smell, because there's a lot of glucose transporters in the olfactory center. There's your sense of smell. We don't know why that's important. But Parkinson's disease, one of the earliest symptoms is a loss of a sense of smell. Maybe insulin's involved. We don't know yet. But insulin seems to be involved with cell-to-cell communication rather than energy transport and disposition.
So it seems like there's a lot more research that's required into what we initially thought insulin's role was and how it works, as opposed to possibly a signaling hormone.
Yes, it seems to have a role as a signaling hormone. But we don't know, haven't got enough information at this point. Think about a baby when it forms within the womb and it's growing. Insulin's an early hormone that is produced. So, it's considering babies receiving all of the nutrients via the umbilical cord, and enzymes needed for digesting food are produced very, very late in the piece, but insulin's produced early. Why?
It must be some signaling aspect.
We don't know this yet. There's, as I said, lots to do with this.
That's fascinating. And we talked, we've kind of discussed about what impact insulin has on our body, but have you got, we talk about metabolic syndrome. Can you explain to people what is metabolic syndrome and how insulin affects that, and insulin resistance, the whole kind of gambit?
Okay, so I'm just going to pull up another picture for you, so bear with me a second. Oops, hang on a second, bear with me. You might have to do some editing.
Because I think once people understand exactly, we now know what insulin resistance is, we know what hyperinsulinemia is, to understand how widespread the effect of insulin in our body is really, it's a really kind of motivating factor for lifestyle change and everything else, to go, man, it's not just, high sugars and everything else we have to worry. This is actually how it's affecting every aspect of our body.
But it's important to realise that having type 2 diabetes is a leading risk factor for developing a lot of different cancers. We don't know exactly why yet, but we do know that metabolic syndrome increases the risk of a lot of different cancers. We also know that there's a link between a lot of the mood disorders. It's hard to tease out whether they're becoming more prevalent because we've got better diagnosis methods, or because they are actually becoming more prevalent because type 2 diabetes is on a rampant increase. If we go back and look at what metabolic, we keep banding around the term metabolic syndrome.
Explain to them in a nutshell, what is metabolic syndrome?
Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of symptoms central adiposity, a fat waist, high glucose levels, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, misknown as the good cholesterol, high blood pressure, inflammation, high uric acid. If you've got these symptoms as a cluster, and usually if you've got one of them, you've got more than one of them, we'll call it metabolic syndrome. There's lots of different diagnostic thresholds for metabolic syndrome, but I think an easy one to use is if you've got 3 of the 5 following issues. You've got a big waist. If your waist is more than half your height, so if you've got a piece of string, as long as you are tall, fold it in half, wrap it around your waist. It should be touching, or you should have some overlap. If those 2 pieces of string don't meet in the middle, you've got some metabolic disease going on.
Right. So I want everyone to go and get that little piece of string now and test their stomach.
There's been a lot of people probably going up for a piece of string. High blood glucose levels, high triglyceride, low HDL, and hypertension. So these top 5, if you've got 3 of the top 5, or you're taking medication for blood pressure, high glucose levels, or for cholesterol, then we can say that you've got metabolic syndrome. If you've got metabolic syndrome, you've got an increased risk of developing certain types of cancers, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now we think about the liver problems as being associated with too much alcohol. But the amount of alcohol that you need to be consuming each week to be considered to have alcoholic fatty liver disease is actually extremely low. And most of those people consume a high amount of sugar. But the scary thing is we're seeing children with large amounts of fat in their liver, which is damaging the organ because of their consumption of fizzy drinks. You know, it's I'm sorry, it really does scare me when I see the kids walking to the local intermediate schools, and you see them walking down the road and their shirt's having trouble meeting in the middle.
And they've got a bottle of 2-litre fizzy drink in their hand. And it really is sad. You know, I wish there could be more done, that we can get that message out there to go, this is not what you should be having on the way to school. And it's, I mean, there's so many different things about that could probably another entire...
That's another coffee conversation in its own right.
Exactly.
But these children are going, over their lifespan, are going to have a shorter quantity and a poorer quality of life because their liver's not happy at this point in time. They've got an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, blood clots, ones that start off in the calf that can end up in the lung, but also smaller blood clots that, when you've got blood glucose problems, increase the risk of organ failure, but also amputations. So you've got blood clots going on, kidneys problems. So when you've got these symptoms of metabolic syndrome, even though things might be going okay at the moment, it's the early warning sign that you're at risk for all of these things, or actually you're at high risk for all of these things. Because what they're now showing is that, I could talk to you in pharmaceutical terms, but it's insulin increases the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system within the kidneys. Basically, it tightens up all of the blood vessels in your kidneys and puts your blood pressure up. You know, people who take ACE inhibitors like cilazapril, we're trying to undo an activated renin-aldosterone angiotensin system. But, you know, if they cut the carbs, or ditch the carbs rather, then that would actually lower their insulin levels, which then it will naturally undo the damage that's happening to their kidneys. And often people can come off their blood pressure medicines fairly quickly. You know, as soon as they manage to, as soon as they ditch the carbs, we often see people needing dramatic decreases in blood pressure medications very quickly.
And that's one of the sort of caveats I often give to the people who start low carb. And I say, you know, people often say, can I do this? I've got a medical condition. I say, yes, you can, but you must be under the supervision of your healthcare professional. I said, because some people have such a dramatic improvement rapidly.
Yes.
You don't want to be on antihypertensives or blood glucose lowering medication, and you've actually lowered both of those naturally. You then become hypotensive and hypoglycemic. And I said,
you get a crash your car, and
exactly.
that
Exactly.
negates benefits you have done. But if you go into it with medical supervision, medical assistance, and we know that, right, this is the day you're going to be starting the changes, depending on how dramatic those changes you're going to be making to your diet and how well motivated you are as a person to stick to it. Sometimes, and this is happening a lot overseas now, people get dramatic changes to their medication before they start.
Yes.
But don't do it at home without assistance.
No,
please.
and I know of one, she was actually a healthcare professional, so she should have known better. She forgot to lower her antihypertensives, then went low carb, and she wondered why she fainted doing her teeth in the morning. And then she goes, oh, I forgot she was still continuing to take them. And it's like, you've got to be monitored because you have these rapid improvements.
Yes.
Absolutely right. You've got to be and see, monitor all the way through and see how you can reduce, whether it's at the beginning or whether reduce. And, we're not giving medical advice to anybody here. You have to see your medical professional.
You have to see.
They can monitor you.
Yes, you've got to be monitored.
Yep. And I don't think people warn people enough. It's not scaremongering. It's actually, you've got to do this in a well-controlled way because the improvements are phenomenal.
And even I've known people who, they are pretty young, pretty fit and healthy, who've gone dramatically low carb and didn't replace enough sodium. So they were all feeling lightheaded and weak and shaky and things not going well because they weren't getting enough monitoring. So even, you think you can do it at home by yourself, but it's good to be checking in with somebody as well to go, what's going on?
Exactly. And I often say as well, when you come off the junk food and the processed food, for most people, that's the majority of their sodium intake, their salt intake. So once you stop the junk food, we actively as a family have to add salt back into our meals, which we never did before.
But insulin's actually involved with that. Insulin actually tells your kidneys to retain sodium. So as soon as your insulin gets lowered, your kidneys are going to excrete more sodium than what they used to do. So it's not just that you lowered your sodium intake, the body's actually going, I don't need to keep this anymore. All right, because there's a sodium glucose transporter within the kidneys that if your glucose is being lowered, then your sodium can also be lowered. So because the insulin's down, your glucose is down, and the body's going, I don't need to keep sodium anymore. Woohoo! So, and it can be really, when I went keto as part of somebody else's PhD study at AUT, it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. It was worse than having a really bad case of influenza.
Keto flu.
The keto flu. I had a really horrible case of it. I basically went home and lay on the couch for about 3 days, and thankfully I could do this because I was in the middle of my own PhD and I just went, I'm working from home. And that was despite trying to keep all my sodium really high with soups and sucking on lumps of salt and everything else. So, even when you're doing it with full knowledge of what you need to do, sometimes it doesn't go well.
Exactly. Now, have you got a slide? I remember you talking about the gingerbread man and showing us exactly, everyone loves the gingerbread man. And this will really, I remember seeing this slide here right at the beginning when I went to quite a few of the sort of presentations you gave up at AUT. And I remember seeing this in a number of ones, and it really, really hits home to people. I think it really does.
Yes, gingerbread man. I was in the middle of writing a manuscript that sort of put this out in the high research terms of all of the aspects that insulin does to the body and at the cellular level, and make sure we've got all the mechanistic and epidemiological evidence around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to work out, did I have everything? So somebody suggested to draw the figure of a person and to draw arrows on it to make sure that I got everything.
I love it. I think it really is a real visual reminder of how insidious insulin is and the effect it has throughout your entire body.
Yes, it does. But I'm a lousy artist. So the reason why this ended up as a gingerbread man, when I showed it to a colleague saying, do you think I've missed anything? First thing she said was, why did you draw a gingerbread man? So
I think it's brilliant. I think it's brilliant.
We can actually thank Karen Zinn for putting the slide together as the gingerbread man. So it was just, a lot of people sort of seem to think
slide, this one.
Well, a lot of people sort of seem to think it was all around carbs and insulin. We should be ditching the carbs and ditch insulin. But it's a case of no, it's just I am seriously a lousy artist. But yeah, you can see that high insulin is involved with all sorts of different states, and some of which we don't fully understand why. I mean, autism, for example, it seems to be associated with high insulin. The studies are not clear. We don't know enough about it. But there's a lot of association between high inflammation and autism. So with some of the things that we've got here, I'm not saying it's the only thing that's going to cause this disease state.
Yes.
And we don't know whether it's it augments the issue. It's the only issue for some people.
But it plays a role. It clearly plays a role.
But it may not play a role for everybody.
No.
There is an association. We need to unpack it and understand more. So I don't want people...
I'm guessing with a lot of these, it's a bit like discovering the insulin in the brain and the signaling effect. It may play a role, but we don't know how.
We don't know how. No, absolutely. The same thing for tinnitus and migraines. For some people, going onto a low-carb diet solves the tinnitus.
Yes, I remember watching an interview with Ivor Cummins with sorry, I can't remember the name of the expert he was interviewing, but
probably Ken Brookler.
Yes, and he was interviewing him about insulin resistance and Meniere's disease and how it can affect the diseases of the inner ear, and it was fascinating. It really was.
But it's not the only thing, because we know that high exposure to noise can cause tinnitus.
Yes.
Now, so if you've got a solely noise damage issue, going low insulin may or may not solve the issue.
Yeah.
But might help for some people. Yeah. But the other big one is erectile dysfunction.
Yes.
Right? Damaging all the blood vessels within the penile tissue through a combination of high glucose and high insulin. But also high insulin levels indirectly causes vasoconstriction because there's not enough nitric oxide to go around. Right now, nitric oxide is something that's incredibly important for the health of our blood vessels. But if you've got inflammation, you deplete your nitric oxide too quickly. Now, with the way that a healthy male sex life is involved, you need a lot of nitric oxide. So the high insulin can actually be a sign, or rather, erectile dysfunction can actually be it's a sign of early metabolic disease.
And I mean, you'll be this, when I used to work in pharmacy and I was registered to sell Viagra, and you had to go through all the different procedures and the different tests before you had to, you gave a screening basically to make sure there was no contraindications, and one of them was high blood pressure. You would question about their blood glucose level, and every time that I had to refuse the sale, it was because they either had a history of type 2 diabetes, and they had one gentleman in particular, his blood pressure was through the roof when he came in to be tested, and everyone, you can see, you could almost tell they had metabolic syndrome when they walked in the door asking for the you could see the big belly fat, which was the dangerous visceral fat. You knew that they had high blood pressure, and I thought, yes, you're coming in for, erectile dysfunction, but actually it's a very telling sign to all the other different patterns that are going on in your body. This is just one little telltale, which in a way is actually quite a good trigger for you to go and see your GP and there is something more at play here. It's not just
Yes.
a sexual dysfunction. There is more metabolic pathways and different systems that are not working as they should inside your body.
Yes, I mean, I've done the sildenafil, oh boy, for years. I mean, I was working at Douglas Pharmaceuticals when it was actually first released onto the New Zealand market, and I've been working with sildenafil pretty well ever since. And you do get the people coming in, and there is this concept of white coat hypertension. Somebody who's really nervous about pushing up the blood pressure. But as soon as you see that big waist, it's a case of we have a problem here.
Exactly,
and it really
exactly.
is a sign. A lot of men about going out to get their warrant of fitness with the doctor. Let's get they understand the warrant of fitness concept. So let's make sure everything is working right. There isn't anything unseen. But that's one of the reasons why anybody coming into the pharmacist for the sildenafil, they need to have had that health checkup in the last year, or they need to be referred on for one.
Exactly, because it just implies, or it just reflects that there is something else going on here. That's just not an isolated incident. There is something else in your body that is not working. And like I say, I can't remember this gentleman. I'm pretty sure his blood pressure was, if not 200, getting towards 200. And it's like, no, honey, you need to go. And it was interesting talking to him afterwards that he goes, oh, well, I eat healthy. And he ate so much fruit, it was unbelievable. And he goes, I eat healthy, because he had this back orchard of his garden, and I discussed about him, that's full of sugar. And he goes, no, it's fruit sugar. We had a really lovely discussion about this, and he was blown away that nobody had told him beforehand. But they don't have time, which is fair enough. But it is a very good, I found doing those sort of health screenings when people would come in and buy it was a very interesting time to just chat about a lot of things that they normally wouldn't chat to somebody about on a really casual basis.
Yeah, no, when I'm talking to people about their 5+ a day, I'm a maximum of 2 pieces of sweet fruit a day.
Yeah. Because fruit and vegetables are not, they are seen as equivalent, but they're not.
But they're not. But I also talk to people about sweet fruits, because capsicum, eggplant, pumpkin, tomatoes, they're all fruits, but we eat them as vegetables. So, hey, go to town on those ones. But if it's sweet, especially if it's a tropical fruits have got more sugar in them than temperate fruits.
Yes.
So, but 2 pieces of sweet fruit a day. And I talk to them also about portion size. What fits into the palm of your hand? That's 1 portion. Bananas are usually at least 2 portions.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I love your, so I think, have we covered all of your gingerbread man? Because I do love this slide. Do you think we've covered everything on there now yet?
Well, I think we have pretty well. But one of the things that's coming through interesting at the moment is there's a link between insulin and bone development. It's one that I really do want to explore further, but it looks like if you've got high insulin levels, you've got an increased risk of osteoporosis.
So this is more as an adult, and I guess it would also affect the children as their bones are developing.
Well, the interesting thing is we tend to think of osteoporosis as a female disease and an older woman's disease.
Yes.
But, okay, here's the big but. I was reading an article, it was the Daily Mail, but it's talking about a lot of male cyclists in the UK developing osteoporosis at a much earlier age. They're putting it down to the cyclists not getting a lot of weight-bearing exercise. But I have to wonder how much of that is also associated with elevated insulin, because a lot of times, especially when you've got the weekend warriors, as I refer to the
middle-aged men in lycra, yep.
Well, it's not just the lycra, but they're the ones who go out hard in the weekends, not necessarily do much during the week. The ultra runners, the triathletes, the adventure racers, and the cyclists. But they often think that because they're doing this much exercise, they can eat whatever they want, high sugar, and get away with it because they're not gaining any weight.
Yes.
You might not be gaining any weight, but you are creating, especially through a combination of diet and exercise, high insulin, high inflammation, high stress, maybe not enough recovery.
Mm.
And that actually can accelerate the aging of a lot of cells,
Yeah.
including your bones.
Yeah.
So, yeah, fine, go hard, okay? Do the exercise, but you don't need that much simple sugar.
No, and I always makes me slightly giggle when I see a whole sort of, like this, the bunch of men, and they've all been out for a cycle, and they either end up at the pub for a pie and a pint, or they end up at a cafe for a trim flat white and then a big, cake or whatever. And it's like, you can't outrun a bad diet. You can't outcycle that bad diet. Yes, you may have worked it off, but you're still doing the damage that high sugar and the beer and the pie and everything else has done.
But you've aggravated that, because exercise does cause stress within the muscles, does cause stress within the joints, does cause stress within the bones.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. It causes stress within the nerves. But with adequate recovery and a good healthy state, it makes everything stronger in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've had your exercise and you're at the pub with the pie and the pint, and usually the big pot of chips with the tomato sauce.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great that you're putting the salt on that. You probably need the salt. But you can have the salt without the potatoes. You're setting up the insulin for the inflammation and the constricted blood vessels and the weakened blood vessels. So your healing doesn't come through as well as what you were hoping it was. So you're not necessarily going to end up stronger than when you started, especially, unfortunately, if you're a little bit older, because all of those healing processes slow down anyway.
Exactly. Hey, look, let's talk about how does a glucose tolerance test not really reflect our insulin levels, and how the progression of insulin resistance to hyperinsulinemia to pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Because I think a lot of people think, once you've got type 2 diabetes, it's progressive and there's nothing you can do. Well, we know we can help people with type 2 diabetes either reverse or control it. But also, actually, when people are told they have a normal glucose tolerance test, that's not actually reflecting what's going on inside, does it?
No, it's not. Okay, let me show you another picture. I really think a picture's worth 1,000 words.
I do.
Right, so we look at this as timeline to diabetes. Now, we've got purple as our blood glucose levels. Now, this is our average blood glucose levels. We know there's always going to be day-to-day fluctuations.
Mm-hmm.
So our y-axis is just increase above normal. Okay?
Yep.
And the green line is our insulin levels.
Yep.
Bottom line is timeline and in years.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is somebody, and our red line is insulin resistance. Somebody at the beginning starts off, they're insulin sensitive, blood glucose levels are absolutely normal, and they have normal insulin levels.
Yep.
But with time, and with my laser pointer gone, and I'm just going to say it's normal Western living.
Yep.
Right? We don't move as much as what we should. We eat more processed foods and more sugar and refined carbohydrates than what ideal. So over time, we do become slowly more insulin resistant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I explained earlier, when you don't change what you're eating, but your insulin resistance starts increasing, you can expect there to be an increase in insulin levels.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the reason why the insulin levels are increasing is insulin is a reactive hormone. Insulin's job is to keep glucose down to a nice, tight band within the body.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't see any changes to our glucose levels.
Because the insulin is being produced more to bring it down to the normal range. Yeah.
Yes. So, here might be our diabetes diagnosis. Here might be our pre-diabetes diagnosis. But look at how much insulin you've got going.
So you can be insulin resistant and hyperinsulinemia for quite some time before it's reflected in the glucose tolerance test.
Yes. There's some evidence to suggest that changes may start happening decades, 10 to 20 years, before you start seeing changes to glucose. Right? Before you start seeing the cardiovascular risks. So, the time to start looking after your insulin levels is now.
Yes.
Okay, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are in your health journey, but the time to start looking after your insulin levels is now.
Exactly. And even if people think that they're skinny and they can get away with eating whatever they want, what is it actually doing? No, what is it doing there to their insulin levels, and they don't realise?
Yeah. Especially the people who say, I've got to eat every 4 hours, or else, I just get hungry and grumpy and hangry. And quite frankly, that was me 10 years ago.
Yep, same.
And I've never been big. I've always been on the skinny end of things. So I always thought I could get away with eating whatever I wanted. The reality is I couldn't. And I'm starting to pay for that now.
Yep.
So, I'm putting on a bit of weight and it's getting a lot harder to lose. You've got to be a lot more careful about what's going on. And it's all of this behind the scenes damage that's going on. So, but the thing that, that people with diabetes get told is that your body can't produce as much insulin anymore. And that is actually true to a degree, because they've always been a super producer of insulin, but the pancreas that's producing all of this insulin, it gets bigger and it works harder and it secretes a lot more insulin. Like anything, it can't keep up capacity forever.
Yeah.
And it's to fail, and it starts decreasing the amount of insulin that it can produce, which is why you see your blood glucose levels going up.
And it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? All of a sudden you're insulin resistant, you're not producing enough insulin, so your blood sugar then it skyrockets.
Your blood sugar skyrockets, but you're still actually a super producer of insulin compared to normal. All right. So although, the medical profession say you can't produce enough insulin, it's because, well, no, that's not quite true. You can't produce enough insulin to overcome your insulin resistance, but you're actually still a super producer of insulin. What happens though here at this point is, although the endogenous, the insulin that your body produces, starts dropping off, I must actually adjust the slide, you actually start being given medication that's going to keep your insulin high.
Yep.
If not higher.
Which is not really what we want.
Oh, it's not what we want. But when you think about for 3,500 years, as a medical profession, we know that insulin in the urine is a bad thing. The person is going to die. Just over 100 years ago, it became too much. Sorry, insulin in the urine. What am I saying?
Glucose
in the urine is a bad thing. Your patient will die.
Yeah.
Just over 100 years ago, it became too much glucose in the bloodstream is a bad thing. Your patient will die. We haven't even, next year marks the 100th anniversary of having insulin available as a treatment. And so we know that from the 1920s is if you can get the glucose levels down in your patients, because you've given them exogenous insulin that's been manufactured, your patient's got a better chance of survival. That's why, we've been indoctrinated to think we have to get the blood glucose levels down under all costs for the patient to survive. It's only really in the last, 40 years, really only really the last 5 to 10 years where it's really starting to come through, where is if you might get your glucose down, but if you don't get your insulin down as well, you're not necessarily stopping a lot of the complications like cardiovascular disease or cancer.
No.
And that's insulin.
You'll be stopping the complications from the high glucose levels and the damaging effect that has, but not from the damaging effects of the insulin, which we now know from your gingerbread man.
Yes, and a lot of the times it's actually very, very difficult to tease out the difference between the damage that's being done by the high insulin and the damage that's being done by the high glucose. Because if you've got high glucose, unless you've got type 1 diabetes or not treating your type 2 diabetes properly, but even then, you've still got high insulin levels.
Yeah.
So we can't tease a lot of these things out. We need to do a lot more research around this.
Yeah. And what can we do to, I think I probably know the answer to this anyway, but for everyone out there, what can we do to improve our insulin sensitivity? Is it just low carb?
It's not just low carb. So, no, I don't have a picture for this.
Oh, that's right.
Right, so we want to reduce our insulin levels. Right, fine. So there's two ways of reducing our insulin levels. One is we don't eat the sugars, the refined carbohydrates, and a high carbohydrate load in the first place. If the glucose is not there in the bloodstreams in big amounts, then we don't need insulin to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's thing number one. Thing number two is if there is some place for that glucose to go to, then it will move out of the bloodstream of its own accord and we don't need the insulin.
Yeah.
Okay, that's exercise.
Muscle building. Yep.
Muscle building basically increases the volume where the glucose can go to.
Yes.
Right? Sprint exercises depletes glycogen within the body. And when there's little glycogen left within the body will turn glucose back into glycogen.
Yep.
So you're decreasing the amount of glucose. But non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. Now, NEAT is what we call activity that's not eating, sleeping, or sports-related activity. It's housework, it's gardening, it's fidgeting, it's getting up and moving around.
Just being generally active in the day, isn't it?
It's being generally active in the day. It's using the pedometer to see, am I getting up every half an hour to walk around? It's parking the furthest car park away from the supermarket doorway, especially if it's not raining. And just, you can usually get a much better car park space as well, actually. And walking that extra distance. It's just doing all of those little things. You burn more energy doing that, so you lower the need for your insulin. So have you got any more slides to show us there? If not, we'll have a wee chit chat after. I've got some questions for you. Yeah, there's just one other thing that I will say. Is we have conversations like this though, and then a lot of people start getting scared about insulin. Right. And they think their insulin should never be high. Now that's actually wrong as well. Okay. Insulin helps build muscle growth. It helps with cell signaling. We do need some insulin. So in an insulin sensitive person, having insulin spikes is actually important. Right, okay. Right. It is having too many, too high, and for too long, that causes the damage. So it's chronic we want to avoid. It's chronic hyperinsulinemia we want to avoid. Acute hyperinsulinemia is a normal physiological process. Yep. And there's benefits to it. In somebody with type 2 diabetes, controlling chronic hyperinsulinemia is probably more important than allowing occasional insulin spikes. In somebody who's insulin sensitive, until we understand why we need insulin spikes, have them, but have them through fruits, have them through the healthy carbohydrates, and quite frankly the occasional treat. Yeah. It's just be aware of what's going on and just don't allow them to blow out. Okay. I've got a couple of slides there on insulin and glucose response patterns. Okay, why don't you tell us all about because I know you discovered all of wonderful Dr. Kraft's work, and that was fascinating how you came across him and all of his insulin patterns. What a wonderful guy. His research and him as a man sounds phenomenal. He died a couple of years ago. But Dr. Kraft was hang on a second, I'll just stop the share for a second. Dr. Kraft was a pathologist in Chicago, and after World War II, it was decided that research associated with radioisotopes needed to come out of the hands of the military, because Hiroshima, and come into the hands of the civilians. Right, so, but one of the things that was discovered about then was that you could piggyback a radioisotope onto a protein and then measure how much of that protein was around in varying tissues and things.
Ah.
So, as I mentioned before, insulin was discovered 1920, started being used 1921, thereabouts. But we weren't able to measure how much insulin we had in a bodily fluid until the 1960s. We could not quantify insulin. So you know how we measure insulin in units?
Yep.
Now, you're a pharmacist, I'm a pharmacist. Do you know what this unit of insulin actually equates to?
I wouldn't have a clue. I just thought it was just a unit, a set measurement of insulin, a set amount. You have blood units, so it was like insulin units, but it's not.
Yes, it's not. Well, it is. But where it came from is even more fascinating than that. When they started making their insulin extracts back in the 1920s, they would get it was bovine and porcine fetal pancreases from the local slaughterhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And they would basically grind them up, extract out the insulin, and you'd have an insulin solution. But, your patient yesterday responded really well to their insulin. How do you know that today's concentration is the same as yesterday's?
Standardize it.
Sorry?
You have to standardize it to units.
It was standardized. And the way they standardized it was they injected the rabbit.
Ah.
1 unit of insulin was the amount of solution required to put your poor rabbit into a hypoglycemic coma. I don't know if the rabbit survived or died. Hopefully they revived the rabbits from glucose. I don't know. The book didn't go into that. But that's where a unit of insulin comes from. So it wasn't until the 1960s that we could actually quantify how much insulin we had using these radioisotopes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Dr. Kraft was a pathologist. They study tissues and disease states and work out what blood markers within the body indicate different disease states. And he had just been teaching an undergraduate course on diabetes and the pathology of diabetes. And insulin is involved with the pathology of type 2 diabetes. And it was theorized back in the 1920s that there would have to be associated with an high insulin level.
Mm-hmm.
Thyroid is a common one. Very common to have with low thyroid and high thyroid. Why should insulin be any different?
Exactly.
He was one of the first in America to be certified for this new radioisotope method for assaying insulin. And at the time, you literally had to be signed off by a nuclear scientist to say that you were safe to handle these radioisotopes. And he started assaying his patients. Now, at the time, they had a minimum of a 4-hour up to 6-hour oral glucose tolerance test. They got 100 grams of glucose, and they lay there in the hospital for 6 hours having frequent blood tests. And he drew every single graph of the insulin and the glucose. And over time, by eyeball, he started to recognize that there were different patterns involved with the insulin and the glucose coming out. And I'll just bring up the... Right, so you should see the insulin glucose
Yep, I can see the patterns, the glucose response patterns.
So the blue is insulin and the red is glucose. Now, these patterns were one that I've done from his research. The glucose, these people all have a normal glucose tolerance test.
Right.
But you can see, when I find my pointer, that the insulin patterns change. It's quite a jump here. These got quite a subtle jump.
Yeah.
But here there's a really big jump.
Yeah.
But you can see that from, normal is Kraft 1. Okay, so we'll start with that. We can see that we have a slight rise between 30 and 60 minutes, and it drops back down quite quickly to 120 minutes.
Right.
These people, we're still getting a rise, 30 to 60 minutes, but we're not jumping back down as quickly.
Mm-hmm.
These people, they don't peak until 2 hours.
Wow.
Sometimes people don't peak until after 2 hours. And what we know, if you've got somebody insulin doesn't peak until 2 hours, so they've got a 40% chance of developing type 2 diabetes in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
If your insulin's down here, it's under 15%.
So we all want to be number one.
Everybody wants to be number one. Right, we've got these Kraft 4s. Now, a lot of people seem to progress through the pattern. We have no evidence to support that.
Mm-hmm.
Kraft did cross-sectional work.
Mm-hmm.
There is some theoretical evidence to suggest that you might go through 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
But I believe the 4s are in a class of their own. Because when you look at the percentages of people with pattern 4, they don't change. Whereas the percentages of people with pattern 1 goes down as you go from normal glucose tolerance to type 2 diabetes.
Right.
The number of people with type 3, hardly any people, smaller numbers of people with normal glucose tolerance have type 3. Huge numbers of people with type 2 diabetes have pattern 3.
Right, okay.
Pattern 4s don't change in percentage. They're very, very tiny in the first place, and they're still very, very tiny with people with type 2 diabetes. I believe it's a sub-pathology that nobody's ever recognized before.
Ah, and you had access to all of his numbers?
Yes. But if you look here at the baseline zeros, fasting insulin doesn't change much.
No.
Between patterns 1, 2, and 3.
But number 4.
But 4, that is the diagnostic feature for who does become pattern 4. And it's a massive change.
Mm.
Okay. Kraft said that normal insulin was between 0 and 30 microunits per mil.
Right.
Pattern 4s start at 50 microunits per mil.
Yeah.
Big change.
Yeah.
The majority of people have a fasting insulin well under 30, well under 20. But when you look at individual variation, I can't look at a fasting insulin level and tell if somebody is a pattern 1 or a pattern 3.
No.
And I've spent hours poring over this data.
But none of the others, because you're not going to know how the progression is. Yeah.
And if you've got normal glucose tolerance, chances are, we haven't gone really deep into the research yet, and there's something that I'm working on. Mm-hmm. You can't tell from your fasting insulin, fasting glucose, whether you're a pattern 1 or a pattern 3. Mm. So something I'm always asked at this point in time is, should I get my insulin levels checked? Honestly, no. All right, in New Zealand, insulin levels are not subsidized. Mm-hmm. And some of the labs don't realize that they can do it. And insulin, quite frankly, is a really difficult thing to measure accurately. You get any of your blood cells, sometimes when a blood sample is being taken, red blood cells, they're fragile. They split open, they spill their contents out into the fluid. Most things doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Insulin, it matters because there's an enzyme within red blood cells called insulin degrading enzyme. Ah. Your red blood cells spill open, this insulin degrading enzyme spills out into the fluid and breaks up all your insulin, so we can't measure it.
No, it's gone.
It's gone. And insulin's fragile, it breaks down at the drop of a hat. It's a really difficult thing to measure accurately. So for people wanting to know, how do I know if my insulin's normal? Mm. Should I get it measured? At this point in time, quite frankly, I'm going to say no, save your money. Mm-hmm. But look at your waist measurement. Can you actually go for more than 4 hours without eating? Mm. Do you have to be constantly snacking or actually getting hangry? Are you somebody whose meal is not complete unless they have something sweet to finish it off? Those are all things to me that says your insulin's high.
I remember reading somewhere, if you walk into a wall and your tummy hits it first, you're insulin resistant.
Yeah, that'd be about right. But for a lot of people though, get the string out. Yes. Seriously, get the string out. Measure your height, fold it in half, wrap it around your waist.
Yeah.
It should meet or overlap.
And I think even once people are aware of their, even starting blood glucose testing, just to see how they react, how long it takes to come down, just even aware of what the foods that they're eating is having an effect on their blood glucose. That's enough for a lot of people to go, man, I never knew that my whole grain organic rye bread still has the same effect as what it's just getting into that
white bread. Yes.
Exactly. It's getting into that mindset of what do you eat and what effect is that having on your body.
And if your blood glucose levels are not coming back down to a reasonable level 2 hours after your meal, your insulin's high.
Yeah.
If your blood glucose levels is high, your insulin will be high.
Mm.
But one of the good things, though, is for people who are testing blood ketone levels, insulin stops the production of blood ketone levels.
Right.
Right? So if you're producing blood ketone levels, that's a good indication that your insulin is under control.
Mm.
It might be spiking from time to time, but overall, if you're producing ketones, you're well on your way to managing your insulin levels.
Yeah. And like I say, it's these are a number of ways to reflect, I guess, your insulin as opposed to testing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the moment, and seriously, I'm working on it. Until
I want to be one of your guinea pigs. I honestly do.
Well, I will be calling for guinea pigs hopefully before the end of the year. But unfortunately, here's one of the odd things. Your menstrual cycle does actually affect insulin resistance.
Hey, look, let's swap screens and let's have a chat about that, because I've got 3 questions actually from my members, so that will be a perfect one. Because one of my questions for my ladies in my group is, how does hyperinsulinemia affect your hormones, whether it's polycystic ovarian syndrome, whether it's menopause? So that kind of blends itself perfectly into that.
Right, short answer is we know it does affect hormone levels. We're still figuring out the details.
Okay, that's the short one.
Okay, that's the short answer. Right, to break it out slightly longer, we know that insulin is involved with signaling within the hypothalamus within the brain.
Right.
Right, the hypothalamus within the brain is kind of the master control for all of our hormones.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so if insulin is affecting the way the hypothalamus is working, we can expect there to be a flow-on effect of hormones down the track.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that popped into my head yesterday when I was reading about all of this was, we know we can get insulin resistance within the brain. Maybe polycystic ovarian syndrome is reflective of cerebral insulin resistance. I have no idea. Seriously, I have absolutely no idea the answer to that one. So I'm not saying it is or it isn't. But there's a good chance that insulin resistance within the brain will affect hormones down the track.
Yeah.
We don't know how, we just know it does. We've got associations. We don't know what those associations mean. But on the other side, high insulin levels means you will generally have high fat mass. Right.
Yep.
Your adipose tissue, your fat tissue, produces hormones. Right? And it can affect the way your sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are produced.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know the details, but we do know that high insulin levels will affect your hormones. Right, so having a higher amount of adipose tissue increases your risk of breast cancer and some of the other hormonal related cancers.
Yeah.
So, we don't know whether it's a direct mechanism, an indirect mechanism, or what's going on. But yeah, if you're having hormonal related issues, I would say try lowering your insulin levels and see if it makes things better or worse.
Well, I know polycystic ovarian syndrome especially, it is intricately linked, and again, we don't know why or how, with the insulin resistance, and they're at a much higher risk of having type 2 diabetes because of everything else. Yes. And I know there are so many women who have had, and again, we're not giving medical advice here, but so many women I know of, especially in one of my groups, there are 6 now ditch the carbs babies because they've now reversed all their insulin resistance, which then allowed them to stabilize their hormones, and then they became pregnant. And it's like, that's such a one, and a lot of these women aren't told that there's this link. And like we're saying, we may not know how it works, but by lowering your carbs, what harm is that going to do? By just eating whole of foods, thinking about how that's going to be affecting your insulin levels, your sugar levels. And like you say, if the body fat is then pumping out the hormones, what detrimental effect is that having? It's just a fascinating, that's another discussion in itself.
Yes.
It really, really is. So that was my question about how does hyperinsulin affect your hormones, and obviously you must do so many ways. And have you got any tips? I guess this will be maybe a different topic for a different day, but you can give me in a nutshell, when people are going through menopause and they just find it so hard to lose the weight, is it a case of, people cruise through menopause easier when they're low carb and they just don't particularly put on the weight as opposed to losing the weight, which maybe their friends will be putting on the weight? Is that more of a, is there any tips there for menopausal women?
Well, ditching the carbs it will help to lower insulin levels, which will allow you to better burn fat. But there's other processes going on. A lot of people who are going through menopause have a lot of difficulty sleeping. Right. Their moods are all over the place. Lowering your insulin levels may actually give you better resilience to manage through all of these things so that you can sleep better. And good quality sleep is one of the most healthful things that we can do, which most of us don't do particularly well. So whether there is a direct relationship or whether it's an indirect relationship, it's most certainly not going to hurt.
No.
And it may do a lot of benefits.
And that's what I kind of say when people are having trouble. I think from what I've understood and what I've read is that people who are low carb through menopause, they have a much better time, they have much lower menopausal symptoms, and yes, they may have maintained their weight, but it's not like maybe their friends who are going through with all the hot flushes, all of the different sleep problems, everything else, and slowly incrementally putting another kilo on every year, another kilo, whereas the ones who are low carb have just maintained and just kind of cruised better than their friends, and their friends are having a harder job of it.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same anecdotal information as well from overseas. Going low carb seems to suggest that people can handle the symptoms a lot better. And if you're not feeling quite so stressed, you're less likely to reach for that sweet treat in the middle of the afternoon, which upsets the cortisol. So there's a lot of things going on. Again, I'm going to say more research is needed as to understanding why, but it's not going to do any harm, and it may really do some benefit.
Exactly. And so then my third and last question from my members is saying, this is a great one. Does artificial sweeteners raise insulin? We know artificial sweeteners for the majority, like 99.9% of people, it doesn't raise their glucose, but does it have an effect on the insulin level? Is that sweet taste triggering something a bit like the xylitol in the dogs?
Right. There's a lot that we're still unpacking around this. But it looks like a sweet taste on the tongue triggers the vagal nerve to start which goes up to the brain and starts preparing the brain. The brain then starts preparing the body for the influx of food, especially the sweet food that it is expecting. Right. So if you knew that you were going to be expecting a glucose bolus, you'd want some insulin around, ready to get things going. So it comes down to the vagaries of studying insulin. It might be different for different people, but it does look like you've got the issues of the low-calorie sweeteners may trigger insulin, but it also triggers the hypothalamus to expect calories. And what they're finding that is people who have a low-calorie sweetened beverage, an artificial sweetener type thing, they'll often end up actually eating more calories because the brain was expecting those calories and they don't get them. So we still need to unpack this out, but I'm going to say the short answer is yes. It does seem to see that for some people at least, a sweet taste on the tongue will trigger an insulin response.
And has that been tested with insulin levels, or is it more theory at this time? The only papers I could find was sort of very, very small that said that they couldn't really draw a conclusion from that. And like you say, more tests need to be done.
I've probably seen some of the same ones, but this might actually come back to a lack of understanding of what the insulin signaling is doing within the brain. So the vagal nerve might trigger release of insulin within the brain, which then triggers something else. So it's a case of we don't know what's going on there. What we do, you know, the way that I talk to people about the artificial sweeteners, it's probably like you do as well, is I look at them as a stepping stone for people to move from a sugar sweetened beverage to a non-sugar sweetened beverage.
Yep. And that's what I always say all the time. I say, you know, I don't like diet drinks, and I don't think long term we want to be relying on them. But there is a place at the beginning when people, especially some ladies I know, they are hooked on litres every day. And if they go to diet drinks, immediately their sugar consumption has dropped dramatically.
Yes.
Then when they're okay with that, then I try and get them off and go, okay, are you having 4 a day? Let's cut that down to 2. Then let's cut it down to 1. Then they've got to go, you know, it has to be water from now on, apart from the occasional one if you want to drink that. And the same with sweetness. You know, as much as I have lots of cheesecakes and cakes and cookies on my website, I always say the minimum amount of sweetener, because we want the whole ethos of living low carb is low carb and whole foods, and to get away from relying on sweet flavors for as often as we used to. But there is a place, like if I said to somebody, you're never allowed cake again, they wouldn't even contemplate starting low carb.
And at the beginning, I never would have contemplated that either. And I would be baking the keto substitutes and the keto breads. But what the really interesting thing that I found is my taste buds change.
Yes, you crave savoury things more.
Well, I still like my chocolate.
Yes, I have my 90%.
I'm 70%. 90% is just too bitter for me.
I've got 95 in the cupboard for tonight. I know.
But I can't eat milk chocolate anymore.
No.
Yeah, I look at a piece of cake and go, that's just revoltingly sweet. So your taste buds do change. One of my biggest tricks, though, for people now for getting off the fizzy drinks is kombucha as a treat. Still some sugar in kombucha, so it becomes the treat. But I'll do a lot of sparkling water with a fruit tea.
Yeah.
Red Seal do a lot of different flavors, and you just dunk it and leave it for a while. I haven't seen any changes to my blood glucose levels. I haven't tested the insulin on it yet, but it doesn't seem to be making a difference, and I can drink a fair amount of that.
Yeah, my children love the blood orange teas. They absolutely love those.
Blood orange, that's lovely warm, but I'm a super fruits or a rose lemonade cold.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah,
but like with the sweeteners, like I say, it's like we've said before, you know, start off at one level, and then as time goes on, you will know your taste buds change. You use the least amount possible. So even if we don't know categorically how it's affecting our insulin signaling, eventually we're not having that much, you know. And I think a lot of people who are sort of anti-low carb, they're saying, oh, you know, have a lot of sweeteners. I go, well, we don't actually have that much sweetener. If I think of how many times I buy a sweetener, maybe 1 packet for our entire family a month, maybe, and that's even for cooking for children, for school lunches and everything else. We don't go through a huge amount, and as time goes on, like you say, your tastes change, and you will require less and less, and you don't crave it anymore, but there is a place for it at the beginning.
Yes, there is.
Yeah. So I think we've answered absolutely everything today. Hopefully everyone can come away now knowing what insulin resistance is, how what carb tolerance is, you know, it's what one person can tolerate compared to another person, hyperinsulinemia and the effect that it has on almost every aspect in our body. But there are still so many things we don't know. We may know that it is working, but we don't know how. Is it the signaling? Is it the direct effect? How these are working? So it's been wonderful to talk to you today, Catherine. And if anyone wants to find out anything more information, I'll put all of your details below. So where can they find you? At your website, and where else?
At my website, I'm also working with Precure. People are wanting to adopt a 21-day lifestyle change that's free. We've got a program going through Precure with that. But yes, no, just basically website, Twitter, pharmacist Kath, but I have to admit, I'm not very good with social media.
It can be very draining. It can be. But I'll put all those links below, and especially Precure. You've reminded me of that. I've just finished the entire health coach course, and I know I've done it all. And I know we only had to do, I think, 5 out of the 6 subjects. I did the whole 6. I loved it so much. I did every single one. So and I'm doing PK 201 next month. So that's all the therapeutic benefits of low carb and ketogenic lifestyle. So anyone who wants to know about that, again, I'll put a link below, and you can find out all the information you need if you want to become a health coach. And that's available to everyone, isn't it? Whether you're a health practitioner or not, or whether it's a personal interest, or whether you're a nurse practitioner, whether you're a receptionist, whether you're working at the gym, anywhere. There's a wide variety of people taking the course, isn't it?
There is, yes, there are.
It really is. And I think health coaches are only going to become more valued and more important in someone's health journey. You know, like the whole big thing is in Precure is prevention is cure, and it absolutely is. We actually at the moment have sick care, not health care. And I think that's the role healthcare coaches have to play.
Yes.
Exactly. So thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us. And anyone who wants any more information, I'll put it down below. So thanks, everyone. Bye.